My name is Amber, and I still taste the salt of that night on my lips. Not from the tears, though there were plenty of those, but from the desperate hope that had crystallized into something bitter and sharp, like sugar burned too long in a pan. I spent 3 days perfecting that cake. 3 days, measuring, mixing, failing, starting over. My kitchen became a war zone of flour dust and broken eggshells. Each failed attempt, another small death of the dream I'd been nurturing since childhood. The dream that maybe, just maybe, I could give my sister something beautiful enough to bridge the chasm that had been growing between us since we were old enough to understand that love isn't always equal, isn't always fair, isn't always returned in the currency you offer it. The first attempt collapsed in the oven, a monument to my inexperience and trembling hands. I stared at the sunken middle, that crater where my hopes had caved in, and I thought about how it looked like my chest felt most days. Hollow, disappointed, reaching for something that kept slipping away. But I didn't give up. I couldn't. This wasn't just about cake. This was about redemption, about proving that the sister who had always been the clumsy one, the awkward one, the one who tries too hard, could create something worthy of celebration. The second attempt burned, black around the edges, bitter and smoking, filling my tiny apartment with the acrid smell of failure. I opened every window, turned on every fan, but the smell lingered like shame, coating everything with the residue of my inadequacy. I sat on my kitchen floor, surrounded by scorched cake pans and my own stubborn refusal to quit, and I laughed. Not the kind of laugh that feels good, but the kind that scrapes your throat raw, the kind that sounds like crying turned inside out. By the third day, my hands had found their rhythm. The batter fell from the whisk in perfect ribbons. The oven hummed like a lullaby. I watched through the glass door as the layers rose, golden, even, beautiful. For the first time in months, I felt something that might have been pride blooming in my chest like a flower I'd forgotten how to grow. The frosting was buttercream, pale yellow like sunrise, and I spent 2 hours making sugar roses that looked almost real if you squinted and believed hard enough. Each petal was a prayer, each delicate curve a whispered hope that this time would be different. This time, Sarah would look at something I'd made and see not the gap between my intention and execution, but the love that filled every imperfect space. I carried that cake across town like I was carrying my own heart outside my body, cradled in my arms and covered with a clean kitchen towel that had been our grandmother's. The same towel that had covered birthday cakes from my childhood, back when celebrations felt safe and joy wasn't something you had to earn through perfect execution of difficult tasks. Every red light, every pothole, every sharp turn felt like a test of my faith, a reminder that beautiful things are fragile and the world is full of ways to break what matters most. Sarah's apartment building rose before me like a challenge, all glass and steel and the kind of modern elegance that I admired but could never afford. The lobby smelled like expensive flowers and success, and I suddenly became aware of my flour-dusted shoes, the small burn on my wrist from the oven rack, the way I probably smelled like vanilla and desperation. But I climbed those stairs anyway, my heart keeping time with my footsteps, that cake balanced in my arms like an offering to a God who might not be listening. The voices hit me before I reached her door. Laughter, conversation, the warm hum of a party already in full swing. I paused on the landing, suddenly aware that I was about to walk into her world with my homemade gift, my amateur creation, my heart worn so obviously on my sleeve that everyone would be able to see exactly how much I needed this to matter. Through the door, I could hear Sarah's laugh, bright and musical and effortless in the way mine had never been. She was telling some story, probably about her work or her travels or the kind of sophisticated life she'd built for herself while I was still figuring out how to make a cake that wouldn't collapse under the weight of my own expectations. I pressed my ear to the door and listened to her voice, trying to memorize the sound of her happiness before I potentially ruined it with my inadequate presence. The knock felt like jumping off a cliff. 3 gentle raps that announced my arrival, my vulnerability, my desperate hope, wrapped in buttercream and tied with a ribbon. I'd changed 3 times before settling on pale pink, her favorite color when we were children, though I had no idea if she still loved it or if, like so many things between us, it had changed while I wasn't paying attention. Amber! Her surprise was genuine when she opened the door, but I couldn't read whether it was pleasant or not. Behind her, the apartment glowed with soft lighting and the kind of effortless sophistication that made my throat tight with something that might have been envy, or might have been admiration, or might have been the suffocating awareness of all the ways I would never measure up. The room fell quiet as I entered, and I felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes cataloging my appearance, my nervousness, the cake in my arms that suddenly felt enormous and ridiculous and so obviously homemade that I wanted to disappear into the polished hardwood floor. These were Sarah's people, her colleagues, her friends, the ones who belonged to the same world of wine tastings and gallery openings and conversations about things I'd read about but never experienced. I said, "I made you a cake," and the words fell into that sophisticated silence like stones into still water, creating ripples I couldn't control or take back. For your birthday, I know you probably already have dessert, but I wanted... The words tangled in my throat. How do you explain to a room full of strangers that you spent 3 days of your life trying to create something beautiful enough to earn your sister's smile? How do you make them understand that this cake isn't just flour and sugar, but the crystallized form of every childhood memory, every missed connection, every time you've wanted to say, "I love you," but weren't sure it would be welcomed? Sarah took the cake from my hands, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw something soft cross her face. Recognition, maybe, or surprise, or the kind of complicated emotion that exists in the space between siblings who have grown up and apart and are still trying to figure out how to love each other across the distance they've created. She lifted the kitchen towel, and I held my breath. The cake sat there in all its imperfect glory, slightly lopsided, the roses a little too sweet, the writing on top, "Happy Birthday, Sarah," just a touch uneven where my hand had trembled. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't professional, but it was mine, made with hands that had learned to be gentle, sweetened with intentions that were pure, even if the execution was flawed. And then she laughed. Not the kind of laugh that says, "This is delightful," or "How thoughtful," or even, "This is charmingly amateur." This was the laugh that cuts, sharp and sudden, and full of something that made my stomach drop like I'd swallowed ice. This was the laugh that said, "Oh, Amber," in the tone that had followed me through childhood, the tone that meant trying too hard again, and missing the mark again, and why can't you just understand that this isn't how things work in the real world? "Oh my God," she said, and her voice carried across the room like a spotlight finding me in the dark. "Did you actually make this yourself? It's so..." She paused, and in that pause, I could feel my heart rearranging itself into something smaller and more fragile. "It's so..." she said, "it's so earnest." Earnest. The word hit me like a diagnosis, like something terminal and embarrassing that I should have been ashamed of all along. Around us, her friends began to murmur, not unkindly necessarily, but with the kind of gentle condescension that somehow hurt worse than outright cruelty. Something about how sweet it was that I'd made it myself. Someone else mentioned how they hadn't seen a homemade cake in years. The words floated around me like smoke, stinging my eyes and making it hard to breathe. "Well, Amber," she continued, her voice gaining momentum the way it always did when she was uncomfortable and trying to talk her way out of the discomfort, "it's just so unexpected. I haven't had a homemade cake since we were kids. It's very nostalgic." Another arrow, finding its target. Another way of saying childish and outdated, and the kind of thing people do when they don't know any better. I watched her set the cake on the counter next to the catered desserts. Elegant tarts and delicate pastries that looked like they belonged in a magazine, not like they'd been wrestled into existence in a cramped kitchen by hands that weren't quite steady enough, by a heart that wanted too much. The comparison was inevitable and devastating. My sugar roses looked like the work of a child next to the spun sugar.
I excused myself to the bathroom, not because I needed to use it, but because I needed 4 walls and a locked door between me and the sound of my sister's world continuing without pause, without acknowledgement of the small earthquake that had just reshaped the landscape of my heart. In the mirror, my face looked pale and strange, like someone I'd met once but couldn't quite place. My eyes were bright with tears I refused to let fall. Not here. Not in Sarah's pristine bathroom with its marble countertops and designer soap that probably cost more than my groceries for a week. I gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles went white, trying to anchor myself to something solid while everything inside me felt like it was dissolving. The laugh echoed in my head, that sharp, surprised sound that had cut through my hope like a blade through tissue paper. But underneath that fresh wound, older injuries began to surface, like sediment stirred up from the bottom of a lake that had seemed calm on the surface. When we were children, Sarah was always the golden one, not just because of her hair, though that helped, those perfect curls that caught light like spun sunshine, while mine hung straight and stubborn as rope, but because of some indefinable quality that made adults pause and smile when they looked at her. She was the kind of beautiful that photographs well, that wins school contests, that makes strangers on the street tell our mother how lucky she was to have such a pretty daughter. And I was always, and Amber too, of course, the afterthought, the one who tried harder because she needed to. I remembered the year I was 7 and Sarah was 9 when I spent weeks making her a friendship bracelet for Christmas. My fingers were too small and clumsy for the intricate pattern I'd chosen, alternating hearts and flowers in her favorite colors, but I persisted with the single-minded determination that would later drive me to spend 3 days perfecting a birthday cake. I worked on it during every spare moment, hiding under my covers with a flashlight after bedtime, creating something that looked handmade in all the wrong ways. Uneven, slightly grubby from my inexpert handling, the kind of gift that announced its amateur origins from across the room. When she opened it that Christmas morning, she held it up with the same expression I'd seen tonight. Surprised, yes, but also faintly embarrassed, as if I'd given her something inappropriate for her age or social standing. She thanked me, of course, because even at 9, she understood the social contract of gift receiving. But I never saw her wear it. I found it months later in the back of her jewelry box, tangled up with broken necklaces and earrings missing their partners, relegated to the place where forgotten things go to die slowly and out of sight. That was the first time I learned that loving someone doesn't guarantee they'll treasure what you offer them, that effort and intention, no matter how pure, can't transform amateur into professional, clumsy into graceful, desperate into desirable. But I kept trying anyway,
Because what was the alternative? To stop caring? To accept that some people are meant to receive love and others are meant to give it, and the math never quite balances out? The bathroom door felt thin against my back as I leaned against it, listening to the muffled sounds of Sarah's party continuing in the next room. Someone had started telling a story that was generating waves of appreciative laughter, the kind of easy, sophisticated humor that belonged to people who knew the right references, who'd read the right books, who moved through the world with the confidence that their jokes would land and their gifts would be welcomed. I thought about the cake sitting on the counter, probably still untouched, growing more pathetic by the minute as it absorbed the contrast with its elegant companions. By now, someone probably had pointed out how sweet it was that I made it myself. The word sweet carrying all the condescension that adults use when they want to be kind about something fundamentally inadequate. Sweet, like a child's drawing hung on a refrigerator. Charming in its innocence, but ultimately disposable. The kind of thing you keep just long enough to prove you're not heartless before quietly throwing it away. The worst part was that I could see myself through their eyes now, and the view was devastating. The sister who never quite learned the rules, who still believed in grand gestures and handmade gifts, who couldn't read the room well enough to understand that showing up to a sophisticated gathering with a crooked cake was like wearing a wedding dress to a funeral. Technically not wrong, but so fundamentally inappropriate that it bordered on offensive. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old photos of Sarah and I, looking for evidence that we once been close, that the distance between us wasn't as vast as it felt tonight. There we were, at age 5 and 7, gap-toothed and sunburned, arms wrapped around each other like we were afraid one of us might blow away. There at 10 and 12, both in matching Christmas dresses that our mother had bought before she understood that Sarah would outgrow the need for twinning long before I was ready to stop trying to. The photos told the story I didn't want to face. How Sarah's smile had grown more polished over the years, while mine remained the same enthusiastic, slightly desperate grin. How her poses became more natural, while mine looked increasingly staged, like I was trying to prove something to the camera that I couldn't quite articulate. How the space between us in the photos gradually widened, even when we were standing close together, as if some invisible force was teaching us to maintain distance even in moments of supposed intimacy. By high school, the pattern was set in stone. Sarah dated the captain of the soccer team, while I wrote poetry in the margins of my notebooks and pretended I was too deep for high school romance. She got invited to parties I didn't know existed, moved through social circles that might as well have been foreign countries for all the access I had to them. I told myself I didn't want what she had, that I was more interested in authentic connections, in meaningful conversations, in the kind of depth that couldn't be found at teenage house parties fueled by stolen alcohol and borrowed confidence. But the truth was harder and more humiliating. I wanted exactly what she had, and I wanted her to want me to have it too. I wanted her to introduce me to her friends with pride instead of obligation, to include me in her plans because she genuinely enjoyed my company, not because our mother had guilted her into inviting her weird little sister along. I wanted to be someone she chose, not someone she was stuck with by accident of birth and proximity. College offered a brief reprieve, a chance for both of us to become new versions of ourselves without the weight of family history pressing down on every interaction. I threw myself into my studies with the same intensity I'd once devoted to making friendship bracelets and birthday cakes, determined to become someone worthy of respect, someone who could hold her own in any conversation. I learned to speak knowledgeably about literature and art, to form opinions about wine and politics, to present myself as someone sophisticated enough to belong in Sarah's world. But sophistication, I discovered, isn't something you can learn from books. It's something you absorb through experience, through growing up in the right circles, through having the kind of confidence that comes from always being welcomed rather than tolerated. I could memorize wine varietals and art movements, but I still moved through upscale restaurants like I was afraid of breaking something valuable. I could quote Proust, but I still chose my clothes like someone who wasn't sure she deserved to take up space in beautiful rooms. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to grow into her sophistication like it was a skin she'd been born to wear. She studied abroad in Paris and came back with stories that sounded like movies and a way of holding her wine glass that made it look like an extension of her hand. She got internships at the kinds of companies I'd never heard of, but that everyone else nodded with impressed recognition. She moved to the city and found an apartment in a neighborhood I couldn't afford to visit, let alone live in. And still, I kept trying to bridge the gap with gestures that grew more desperate even as they became more elaborate. Handmade Christmas gifts gave way to carefully chosen books I thought she'd appreciate, which gave way to expensive dinners I couldn't really afford.
3 weeks passed before Sarah called. 3 weeks during which I did not reach out first, did not send follow-up texts thanking her for including me, did not apologize for leaving early or worry about whether she'd noticed my absence from her social media likes and comments. 3 weeks during which I practiced the radical act of not performing my devotion, not proving my love, not working overtime to maintain a connection that had never been equally weighted. It felt strange at first, this new passivity. My fingers itched to type messages I didn't send, to check her Instagram stories and heart every post, to be the sister who remembered and reached out and cared enough to bridge whatever silence had opened between us. But each time I felt the familiar urge to chase, to pursue, to close the distance through sheer force of will, I remembered the sound of her laughter that night, the casual cruelty of being discussed like a well-meaning but ultimately exhausting pet that couldn't quite learn proper behavior. So I waited. And in the waiting, I discovered something remarkable. I was okay. More than okay, actually. I was sleeping better, eating meals without the background anxiety of wondering whether I'd said the right thing in our last conversation, walking through my days without the constant low-level worry about whether I was being enough, thoughtful enough, present enough, worthy enough of the love I'd been working so hard to earn. I threw myself into my own life with an energy I didn't realize I'd been rationing. I took a pottery class and loved the feeling of creating something beautiful without needing it to communicate anything to anyone else. I rearranged my apartment, keeping only the books I genuinely wanted to read, the art that actually spoke to me, the possessions that felt like extensions of my authentic self, rather than props in a performance of who I thought I should be. I made friends with my neighbor, Maria, an elderly woman who appreciated my tendency toward intensity because she was equally passionate about her garden, her books, and her strong opinions about local politics. With Maria, I didn't have to modulate my enthusiasm or apologize for caring too much. She matched my energy with her own, and our conversations felt like collaborations rather than auditions for approval. I started writing again. Not the careful, literary pieces I'd crafted in college hoping to impress professors and peers, but honest, messy reflections on what it meant to love people who couldn't love you back in the same currency, what it felt like to realize you'd been performing your own life instead of living it. The words came easily, flowing from a place of truth rather than strategy.
And I remembered why I'd fallen in love with writing in the first place, not because it made me seem deep or cultured, but because it helped me make sense of the world, helped me transform pain into something that felt like wisdom. When Sarah's name finally appeared on my phone screen, I stared at it for a long moment before answering. Not because I was angry, the anger had dissolved weeks ago into something cleaner and more sustainable, but because I wanted to make sure I was answering from a place of centeredness rather than desperation, from genuine interest rather than grateful relief. "Hey," she said when I picked up, and her voice sounded different somehow, less polished, more uncertain. "How are you? I feel like I haven't heard from you in forever." "I'm good," I said, and realized it was completely true. Really good, actually. "How are you?" We talked for a few minutes about surface things, work, weather, a movie she'd seen. But underneath the pleasant chatter, I could sense her circling around something larger, something she wasn't quite ready to address directly. Finally, she took a breath and said, "I've been thinking about your cake." My heart did a small skip, not because I was hoping for vindication, but because I was curious about what had prompted this revisitation, what had made her reach out after 3 weeks of silence I hadn't tried to fill. "Have you?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. God, this is harder than I thought it would be." She paused, and I heard her take what sounded like a steadying breath. "I kept thinking about how much work you must have put into it and how I reacted, and I realized that I never actually told you how it tasted." "How it tasted?" "I tried a piece after everyone left. Actually, I ate like 3 pieces. Amber, it was really, really good. The frosting was perfect, and the cake itself was so moist, and those little sugar roses, I have no idea how you made them look so real." I closed my eyes, feeling something complex move through my chest. Not vindication exactly, but a kind of bittersweet satisfaction. The cake was good. My work, my effort, my 3 days of trying, it had been worth something, even if that worth hadn't been immediately recognized or celebrated. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot." "I think—" She hesitated again, and when she continued, her voice was smaller, younger somehow. "I think I was embarrassed by— not by the cake exactly, but by the fact that you'd had put so much thought into it when I'd just ordered catering without thinking twice. By the fact that you still do things like that, make things with your hands, put time and care into gestures that I've gotten too busy or too sophisticated, I guess, to do myself." The word sophisticated sat between us like a bridge we were both trying to figure out how to cross. "I wasn't trying to make you feel bad," I said carefully. "I know you weren't. That's what made it worse somehow. You were just being you, being the sister who remembers what matters, who still believes that homemade means something. And I made fun of that in front of everyone." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was full, pregnant with all the things we'd never said directly, all the ways we'd misunderstood each other, all the years of operating from different scripts without realizing we weren't even in the same play. "Sarah, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "Let me finish," I said gently, "because I think this is important for both of us. I spent so many years thinking that if I just tried hard enough, if I just loved you perfectly enough, if I just showed up in exactly the right way, you would, need me the way I needed you, appreciate what I had to offer the way I appreciated everything about your life." "Amber, let me finish," I said gently, "because I think this is important for both of us. I spent so much energy trying to be someone you would want to be close to that I forgot to ask whether the closeness I was seeking was actually good for either of us, whether the way I was loving you was actually loving or just desperate. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with what might have been tears. You think the way you love me is desperate? I think the way I used to love everyone was desperate, including you, especially you. I think I was so afraid of not being enough that I made myself into too much, and then I was hurt when that felt overwhelming to the people I was trying to connect with. You were never too much, she said quickly. I was, though, and that's okay. We're allowed to be too much for some people in some relationships. The problem isn't being too much, it's not believing that the right people will experience our too much as just right. Another pause. Then, do you think we could try again? Differently? The question hung in the air, and I felt the familiar tug of hope, the old desire to say yes immediately, to rush toward any possibility of connection without considering what kind of connection was actually sustainable, actually healthy, actually wanted by both parties. But this time I took a breath and asked myself what I actually wanted. Not just what I thought I should want, or what would prove I was forgiving, or what would restore the relationship to some imagined state of closeness that probably never existed in the first place. I'd like that, I said slowly, but I think we'd need to be honest about who we are now, not who we used to be, or who we think we should be. And I think we'd need to let each other be enough, as we are. Enough? She repeated, like she was tasting the word. I spent so many years trying to be more for you, more interesting, more sophisticated, more worthy of your world, and I think maybe you spent some energy trying to be less judgmental, less aware of our differences, less bothered by the ways we don't naturally fit together. Maybe, she admitted. What if we just were? What if you got to be the sister who has catered parties and designer soap and friends who talk about things I don't always understand? And I got to be the sister who makes cakes and writes in journals and cries at movies you think are silly?